Hey everybody! Today we'd like to talk a little bit about abnormalities and emergencies. You know, if you're out there flying VFR in visual conditions and an abnormality or some type of an emergency occurred, you know, you've got a pretty fair amount of options. Now, if you're on an instrument flight plan and you are in IMC conditions, then when abnormalities and emergencies occur, your options are much more limited, and you want to be very familiar with specific procedures and techniques and FARs. That's right, welcome back to the Epic Flight Academy, everybody. This is our instrument rating course. I'm your host, Mike Thompson, and man, are we glad you're here watching these videos. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and don't forget, as always, there are 3 keys to your success. Number 1, you are enrolled in Epic's instrument rating online course and studying that material. Number 2, you join yours truly here with these videos. And number 3, be sure to review all of this one-on-one with your flight instructor. Now, today we have a guest speaker whom you are already familiar with, and he's going to join us to talk about this, Mr. Shane Williams.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be back.
How you doing, buddy? Our Director of Flight Ops here at Epic Flight Academy. And Shane, I think you've actually had some of these abnormalities and emergencies occur in flight, haven't you?
Fortunately or unfortunately, I actually have. I have incurred a few of these. Like Mike was saying, when you're on an IFR flight plan and you're in the instrument world, abnormalities and or emergencies can get a little bit different. They can be tricky. Most while because there's a lot of procedures now that go into it. ATC has a much bigger play and part in these decisions, and they kind of have to know what we're doing just as much as we do. So let's dive right into it, right? The first one that you can experience is a lost communications issue, right? So this is when you are no longer able to communicate with ATC on this IFR flight plan, possibly in IMC conditions, so you cannot see outside. Now, if you can see outside, things get a little bit easier. If you cannot see outside, there are a lot more specific procedures that need to be followed. Now, lost communications as a whole usually does not happen very often. And when it does, there are some easy troubleshooting techniques and tips that we can do to try to solve these issues. Some of those things can be the volume on your headset just happened to get a little bit too low, right? Maybe your knee or your leg unplugged one of your headset jacks, right? You may have tuned in the wrong frequency when you were switching from one controlling agency to another controlling agency. Also, possible circuit breakers may have popped out on the panel down below you where you're flying, right? These are all some very common things that we can check as pilot in command to try to mitigate and fix these issues. Now, if these issues do not work, right, your next step is that you want to squawk 7600 in your transponder code. This code on the radar will alert ATC and tell them that you as a pilot are having trouble communicating with ATC. Now, like we mentioned just a second ago, if you're in VMC or visual meteorological conditions, the FAA expects you to maintain those VMC and VFR conditions and to land at an airport under visual conditions as soon as practical. It doesn't need to be immediately, but they just want you to land as soon as practical. Now, if you are in IMC or instrument meteorological conditions or actual and you cannot see outside, things get a little bit different. Let's get into it. Right? So for your altitude, right? Because there's 2 things that you want to pick, your altitude and your routing to get to this destination. In terms of your altitude, there's an easy acronym known as MEA. Let's get into it. So for the M, that is going to be your minimum IFR altitude. whether that is your MEA for the route, your MOCA, your TAA, your MSA, or your AROCA. These are all different options that you can use when you're determining this minimum IFR altitude. The next, the E, this is your expected altitude. This is usually when ATC will put a time restriction or a time compliance on an altitude they have given you. The last one, A, that is your assigned altitude. So that's going to be the very last thing that ATC has assigned to you. And that is where the MEA acronym comes from that will help you make this altitude decision. Now, what about the other half, right? We also have to figure out our route. How are we going to get to our clearance limit or to our destination airport? Well, there's another fun acronym. It's known as AVF. And let's jump into that. So for the A, that's going to be assigned. So that again is something that ATC has previously assigned to you for a route. The V, that is known as a vectored route. Now, in that, ATC sometimes will vector you around weather, around other aircraft, things like that. And that is the vectored route assignment that you would want to follow. Next, E, this is your expected altitude. Again, sometimes ATC will put a time restriction for your route that you are expected to follow as pilot in command. The last, F, filed, right? If all of these, if you've gone through them all, the last thing that you're going to rely on is what you've actually filed on your flight plan with the FAA before you have taken off. And you want to follow these in that order. Now, we figured out our altitude, we figured out our route, but how do we land? How do we know when to land? Well, that walks us into the next part of this, right? So if you reference 91-185 in the FAR AIM Charlie number 3, you'll get into what's known as your clearance limit, right? This is kind of the last point that ATC has cleared you to. But now you don't know what to do next. Well, that's okay, because we have specific procedures that we can follow to do that. Now, your clearance limit is usually going to be an initial approach fix for an approach, or sometimes it may not be an initial approach fix. And that's okay. If it is an initial approach fix, you will then look and see if you have an EFC, or an expect further clearance time. If you do have an EFC, an expect further clearance time, and it is an initial approach fix, you want to commence that descent or descent and approach as close as possible to that EFC time. If it is an initial approach fix and you do not have an EFC, you want to commence that descent or that descent and approach as close as possible to your ETA time. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Now, what if your clearance limit is not an initial approach fix and you do have an EFC time? Well, you want to leave that clearance limit at the EFC, and then you want to proceed to a fix where that approach begins, commence your descent, and shoot that approach. But what if you don't have an EFC time? Well, on this one, you would want to arrive over the clearance limit, proceed to a fix from where an approach will begin, and then again, you want to commence your descent or your descent and approach as close as possible to your ETA. So those things can get very, very tricky, and you always want to make sure you're up to date on these regulations also, so that ATC also will know what you're going to do inside the airplane. Now, our next abnormality or emergency that can occur is an instrument error, right? Now, the pesky red X, as you guys will learn when you start flying in the sims in the airplane, right? When you incur one of these, it is mandatory that if you cannot continue on that IFR flight plan, you need to report that to ATC, right? Once you've reported that to ATC, what you want to do at that point is very much try to stabilize the aircraft, right? Make sure you're in control of it before you start to try to diagnose and troubleshoot these issues that are going on in the flight deck, right? If the instruments cannot be used, this is where you're going to rely on your training, and you're going to trust those standby instruments that you have below you that are working. As long as ATC knows, though, they can always try to help you and or give you some priority in the airspace if you happen to need it. So never forget to alert them. Now, what if you're flying along and you lose your ability to navigate? Whether you lose GPS, you'll lose a VOR. What if you lose those things, right? How do we handle that then? Well, again, the first thing that you're going to want to do is alert ATC to this problem, right? Again, so that they can help you and or give you some priority. If you are unable to navigate, right, sometimes they can direct you directly to an approach path, and they can help you get in a good position to shoot and approach into an airport. Now, if none of those options work, there are things out there known as a PAR or an ASR approach that ATC is very well trained on, and they can help guide you to a safe landing. Now, what if you're flying along and you happen to lose electricity? Well, electrical in these types of airplanes become a very big deal. There are a lot of things that use electronics inside our airplane. Now, the first thing that you would want to do is you would want to check your checklist, right? On your checklist, it's going to give you different things to try to troubleshoot, to try to fix this issue. One of the things on the checklist you'll see on the slideshow is it says that you should only reset your circuit breaker one time. So if it does happen to pop out, you can push that in one more time, but you don't want to do it more than that, because if you do it more than that, that can risk a fire on board the airplane. Now, if you've gotten all the way through it, the checklist will then tell you that you want to try to conserve your batteries, right? Because at this point, your batteries are all that you have left. There's nothing making electricity. In terms of your batteries, you want to try to turn off some of those extra exterior lights or interior lights that you may not need at this moment to continue flying. You may want to dim some of the screens that you have in front of you. Again, trying to relieve some of that take off of the battery. In turn, you want to turn off anything you feel is unnecessary at this point that is taking battery power from the battery. Now, the worst case scenario, if you use all of your power and you have no standby battery, you have no main battery, right? You will be severely limited at what you can do in the airplane. You will really only have your magnetic compass to move around and navigate. Now, if you still happen to have your standby battery, that's good news, right? Because on your standby battery in the Cessna 172S, that battery will last for 30 minutes. Now, if you are operating on only that standby battery, you can reference your PIM or your POH in the electrical system, and it will tell you exactly what is on the essential bus, which the standby battery is powering. There's a really cool acronym that's known as PCANs, and you guys can go over that with your instructors when you get to that point. And pretty much at this point, that goes through some of the main and abnormalities and emergencies that you can possibly encounter in the airplane.
Hey Shane, that is awesome information. So it sounds like when we are on an IFR flight plan IMC, things get a little more complicated.
They sure do, Mike. They sure do.
Well, hey, thanks for joining us. Now, you want to join me in the sign-off?
I would love to.
Okay, so the way it goes is, all right, folks, we'll see you next time, and then we salute. Okay, you ready? Here we go. All right, folks.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.